that Achremot is one of the most difficult parshas to say anything wise about. And I'm going to fall right in line and not talk about the parsha. But I would like to just cite what our dear friend Mark Brettler lists as the articles available for this Shabbat in the Torah.com. Azazel, demon deity. One on Amos, but not on Haftarah, but not on the section we read, but on social justice passage. Scapegoat ritual, 4 essays on different forms of incest, 1 essay on polygamy, the obvious one on homosexuality, and an additional one on sexual prohibitions. That's a tough challenge for me and many others, I can assure you. And I want to make sure that Stan Levy's comment about Rabbi Sager, 1986, you said? Late 80s, changed the Parsha for Mincha on Yom Kippur in deference to his recognition of the LGBTQ community. That was huge. And I'd like to congratulate also our own Rabbi Graber, also on Yom Kippur, about 8 years ago, when he changed his mind on the gay community and announced it on Yom Kol Nidre evening and got a standing ovation with applause. So there has been a sea change in this congregation, thank goodness, in regard to the gay community, and many of these outdated, inappropriate laws in the Bible. Many of you know that I have spent more than 50 years in biblical scholarship and archaeology of the land of Israel. I love the Bible. I've spent my life studying it, but there are sections that clearly are not appropriate for public discourse any longer. That said, I won't make my plea for the triennial cycle. I always do that. And I have failed for 53 years making that, but I won't say it. I want to say something positive about our biblical tradition. And I want to talk about the destruction of the temple and why I don't celebrate Tisha B'Av. I'm in my usual position as a font terrible today. I want to talk about biblical Israel's constructive response to tragedy as an alternative to the lachrymose view of Jewish history, which has dominated history writing in Jewish circles for so many years, whether it's the domination of persecution in medieval times or the domination of the narrative of the Holocaust. I want to speak how Jews confronted a tragedy in the most creative way. The same thing happens, by the way, in 7, and reinvent themselves, and how the period after the destruction in 586 BCE is one of the most creative, important times in biblical history. And by the way, this has been going on in scholarship for about a generation. That is the Persian period. The lachrymose view is represented for me most clearly in Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung our lyres, for there our captors required us. Songs. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. And Eicha, the book of Lamentations, carries on the same tragic recitation of verses about the fall of Jerusalem. What we know from archaeology and history now, there was not a wholesale destruction of the land of Israel in 586, and maybe 40 or 50%, if that, left the land. Most people stayed behind. And this has been a subject of scholarly inquiry now for also about 20 years. And I think the results are in. The myth of the empty land, therefore, that has dominated Jewish understanding of what happened after 586 is simply out of date, inaccurate, and wrong. Who was exiled? First and foremost, elites, the priestly caste, the royal family, the Davidic house, and temple functionaries. This elite class probably were the ones who came up with a plan. But first, let's talk about the theological response to the exile and to the destruction. The Deuteronomic view held sway, and we saw it at the end of the Parsha today, about if you follow the laws of the land of Israel, somehow things are going to work out. What the destruction and exile by the Neo-Babylonians showed the Israelites, things didn't work out as they had been promised. Even if you had observed the covenant laws, you may well have suffered or lost loved ones and family. So the prophets, the book of Job, come up with alternative understandings of the meaning of suffering. The most marketable one was probably Isaiah's view of the suffering servant, which was adopted completely by the Christian religion 600 years later. Isaiah 53 being the chapter par excellence, which elucidates the theological response to suffering and theodicy. He, Israel, in Jewish understanding, bore the sins of many and made intercession for transgressions. So that is one alternative. Jeremiah was a pacifist. He was against the war. He wanted to spare the city and was exiled where? To where? Egypt. Just like Josephus in 68 CE. Ezekiel painted a picture of a restored temple and a new Messiah called Prince. And Job invoked the mysterium tremendum, not a clear answer to the issue of theodicy and unexplained suffering in the world. So the theologians, the biblical authors, were struck by the inappropriateness of the dominant Pentateuchal theological view that somehow the Israelites deserved that suffering. That's one response. Literary response. Lots of these responses to tragedy are literary. But look at the first permanent exile results in two diaspora centers that were to become two of the most important centers of Jewish life for thousands of years to come. Egypt, that's where Jeremiah wound up. You have Elephantine, Yeb, 100 years later, having kind of a new form of Yahwistic religion, Jewish religion in Egypt. And 100 years after that, the Septuagint is translated, the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek. That's just a couple of 100 years after this by the Jewish community. In Mesopotamia, we now know from Assyriologists working 2 large corpora of data. We know of a large banking family, the Murashu family, succeeded in establishing their imprint on Mesopotamian society in the 5th and beginning of the 4th century BCE. And further south in Mesopotamia, Tel Yahud or Yahudiya, we have evidence of Jewish communities flourishing in Mesopotamia 100 years after the destruction. Ezekiel, in chapter 11, verse 16, describes the prayer form of the exile as occurring within a mikdash me'at. The Talmud, 1,000 years later, in Megillah 629a, takes this as the beginning of the synagogue, praying without all the stuff you read about today, without the sacrifice, prayer in a mikdash me'at. The idea of prayer without sacrifice was born. I want to go back to literary accomplishments. This is the biggie. The elites who survived 586 began to edit and publish in their way what we know as the Bible. The Chumash is more or less adopted in its proto-Masoretic form. Genesis through the former prophets are also attached to the Chumash, to the Pentateuch. Many scholars, like myself, I call that the primary history, the big story of Israel till the destruction, which is pulled together in the Persian period. I would call this the first edition of the Bible. The prophetic corpus is not far behind, but let's mention the most famous individual from a Jewish standpoint in this period, Cyrus the Great. The only non-Israelite mentioned as God's servant in the Hebrew Bible. The Persian king who in 550 defeated the Neo-Babylonians and ruled, whose family ruled for over 200 years in the Levant. He is called in Isaiah 44, the last verse of that chapter, 28, shepherd, and in chapter 45, verse 1, Mashiach, Messiah. And I sadly report that many evangelicals have taken President, begins with a T, I won't even say his name in shul, as Messiah. They've had conventions for 45, citing this verse, Isaiah 45, verse 1, as justifying the messianic claims of his presidency. Oy vavoy. The temple is rededicated in 515, 35 years after the conquest of Babylonia by Cyrus the Great and his son. During this period, Haggai, Zechariah are the prophets of the return. And in the next century, we get a new version of 1-2 Kings and 1-2 Samuel, 1-2 Samuel, 1-2 Kings, in the form of Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1-2 Chronicles. But Ecclesiastes is written. The book of Jonah is written at this time. Look at this creativity in response to the loss of land and temple. I think to me, it's an amazing accomplishment. This is how Jews have traditionally reacted to times of urgency, times of crisis. And if I would have time, which I don't plan to do right now, I would switch to 70 and show that the real synagogue as we know it was born after that. The real liturgy as we inherited it was born after that. The Mishnah, the Midrash, the Talmud comes in response to the loss of the temple. What a record of achievement in time of tragedy. So let's call the Jews the comeback kids. And let's hope that our fellow sufferers in Ukraine have the ability to overcome the challenges that they face. Our hearts, I know, for most of us, are in Ukraine. And I learned only 2 weeks ago that my maternal grandmother's father and mother were from Odessa. Amen.
Yashikawa.